This story didn't begin as a personal journey, but it became one the moment a line was crossed and the narrative changed forever. Before we go any further, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the important updates and deep dives that are still ahead. For nearly a year, coverage of Daystar remained focused on leadership, governance, and institutional conduct. It was the kind of reporting that keeps a necessary distance, documenting facts, timelines, and public statements while maintaining a professional boundary. No one expected to be pulled into something far more intimate and disturbing. The focus was never meant to settle on Jonathan and Susie Lamb and their children in such a direct and painful way. Yet as the months unfolded, the story narrowed, the stakes rose, and what once felt like a corporate or ministry controversy transformed into something far heavier. When a situation begins to involve a family, especially children, neutrality becomes harder to maintain. Observers who initially watched from a distance found themselves emotionally invested, not because they sought drama, but because the implications reached beyond policy disputes and into the realm of moral responsibility. That shift became unmistakable when allegations involving a child entered the picture. At that moment, the entire tone of the discussion changed. This was no longer about board decisions, resignations, or public-facing disagreements within a Christian media network. It became a moral crisis that demanded seriousness, care, and clarity. Allegations involving a child carry a weight that cannot be overstated. They cut through ideological differences and theological debates and land squarely in the conscience of anyone paying attention. Parents, caregivers, survivors of abuse, and advocates for children all recognized the gravity instantly. The presence of a child in the allegations elevated the situation beyond institutional reputation and into the fundamental question of protection and accountability. Even the most cautious observers understood that this was not a story that could be managed with standard public relations language. It required empathy, transparency, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, regardless of where they led. When law enforcement eventually closed the investigation, the announcement landed with a heavy and complicated impact. Authorities cited insufficient evidence and a lack of victim outcry as the basis for ending the case. From a legal standpoint, this marked the conclusion of official proceedings. On paper, the matter was resolved. But emotionally, it felt anything but finished. For many following the story, the closure came with a sense of deflation rather than relief. The absence of charges did not translate into a sense of peace. Instead, it left behind a lingering exhaustion, the kind that comes from prolonged tension without meaningful resolution. Viewers were left holding unanswered questions, unsure how to reconcile the seriousness of the allegations with the quiet finality of the legal outcome. The case may have ended in the eyes of the law, but it remained very much alive in the hearts and minds of those who had followed every development. That disconnect between legal closure and moral satisfaction became one of the defining tensions of the story. Officially, the process had run its course. Unofficially, many felt as though nothing had truly been addressed. Closure on paper did not translate into closure in conscience. Instead of healing, there was fatigue. Instead of clarity, there was confusion. People wrestled with how something so troubling could end with so little public reckoning. This emotional gap highlighted a broader truth that often emerges in cases like this: legal standards and moral expectations do not always align. What meets the threshold for procedural correctness may still fall painfully short of what communities need in order to feel that justice, or at least accountability, has been pursued with sincerity. For parents, survivors, and advocates, the outcome felt particularly unsatisfying. The legal resolution, while technically sound, did not reflect the gravity of the allegations in their minds. Many were not demanding a predetermined outcome, they were seeking acknowledgement, compassion, and visible concern. The absence of those elements made the conclusion feel hollow. Survivors of abuse, in particular, recognized a familiar pattern, one where the truth may be spoken, yet justice and compassion remain elusive. For them, the case reinforced a painful lesson learned through experience, that systems designed to protect institutions often move more decisively than those meant to protect individuals, especially the most vulnerable. As the legal process faded from public view, attention turned sharply toward leadership, particularly Joni Lamb. Her public posture became a focal point for both criticism and analysis. Observers noted her measured tone and administrative framing of events, which some interpreted as professionalism under pressure. Others, however, saw something else entirely. They perceived an absence of visible grief, outrage, or pastoral engagement, emotions they expected to see when allegations of this nature surface within a faith-based organization. In a context where spiritual leadership is expected to embody compassion and moral clarity, the lack of an emotional response struck many as deeply unsettling. It wasn't necessarily what was said, but what seemed to be missing, that fueled concern. Silence and restraint can sometimes be wise, especially during ongoing investigations. But in this case, many interpreted the emotional neutrality as avoidance rather than discernment. When a story involves alleged harm to a child, people expect leaders to speak not only with legal caution but with moral urgency. The calm, reserved communication style felt to some like a barrier rather than a bridge. Instead of drawing the community together in shared concern and care, it appeared to create distance. That distance became fertile ground for mistrust, as audiences struggled to understand why expressions of empathy and sorrow were so limited. The communication strategy adopted during this period further complicated matters. Official statements were brief, carefully worded, and unmistakably legalistic. They prioritized procedural closure over emotional care, emphasizing the end of the investigation without addressing the broader impact on viewers, families, and survivors. This approach left a vacuum, and as history has shown time and again, vacuums do not remain empty for long. In the absence of robust, compassionate communication from leadership, speculation and independent commentary filled the space. Online platforms, watchdog voices, and concerned observers began interpreting the story for themselves, often with frustration and skepticism. The narrative slipped away from institutional control, shaped instead by those who felt unheard and unsatisfied. As this unfolded, many recognized a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar. Faith-based scandals in the past have often followed a similar arc: serious allegations, prolonged silence, quiet conclusions, and institutions emerging legally intact but morally questioned. The echoes of those past cases were impossible to ignore. For long-time observers of Christian media and ministry culture, the similarities raised alarms. It wasn't just about one family or one organization anymore. It was about a system that, time after time, seemed ill-equipped to handle allegations of this magnitude with the transparency and humility they require. For survivors of abuse watching from the sidelines, the conclusion reopened old wounds. The story became a mirror reflecting their own experiences of not being believed, not being supported, or watching accountability slip through the cracks. The closing of the investigation reinforced a fear many already carried, that truth alone does not guarantee justice, and that compassion is not always extended where it is most needed. Instead of bringing comfort, the ending intensified grief and reinforced a sense of isolation for those who had hoped this case might mark a turning point. In the end, the silence surrounding the verdict spoke louder than the verdict itself. The story remains emotionally open, unresolved in ways that legal language cannot address. It has come to symbolize a larger crisis of trust within Christian media, where procedural endings without humility and visible care leave wounds unhealed and faith unsettled. The impact of this case will likely linger, not because of what was proven or disproven, but because of how it was handled and how many people felt left behind in the process. As this chapter closes officially, the questions it raised continue to echo, challenging institutions to consider not just how they protect themselves, but how they protect the hearts and lives of those who look to them for guidance. If you want to stay informed as this conversation continues and more stories unfold, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next.